Environmental Observation Network. Glenn's research is focused on linking plant ecology with carbon and water cycles in Africa, particularly in the fynbos biome. Methods of research are mainly based on remote sensing and ecological models. So, yep. Glenn, you can take the stage is yours.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for attending this. I can see the participant. There's 61 participants, so that's quite impressive. Maybe we should continue to do these Toolbox talks virtually only. So I'm really impressed with the turnout. So today I'm going to start sharing my screen soon and give you guys some content. What I'm going to start with, I'm going to paste into the chat box. I'm going to paste this tutorial that I'm going to give is I've put it up as a there's a little blog, like a website that kind of goes through all of what I'm going to teach you today, and you'll be able to kind of follow along with what I'm doing. I'll go through it as I talk, but it's on a little website. It's going to go onto our Sound website once we manage to get that up and running in a couple of days, hopefully. So you'll find it in our Sound website as well. But for now, this is kind of a temporary link for where I've just put it, just so that you all have it available today. So I'm just going to copy that link and paste it into the chat box here. So you guys should all see that link. So if you click on that, you'll see what kind of where we're starting. So I'm going to share my screen now, and on my screen, basically, you should see this tutorial as well. Okay, so let me just check. Can everybody? I'm just bringing up the chat box. Can everybody see what's on my screen at the moment? So I've got this is just my my Google Chrome. Great. Okay, so it seems like you can all see and you can all hear. So we are ready to go. Okay, so come on, tutorial. Okay, no, that doesn't want to do that. Let's do this. Sorry, just technical. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to keep this chat box just open here next to me so I can kind of see you guys are good, what's going on here. So this tutorial is about reproducibility in R, and kind of one of the main reasons why we use R and why we do all of our coding in these kind of open source softwares is motivated by the fact that we want other people to be able to easily reproduce our work. We want to be able to reproduce other people's work, and this is really part of this whole spirit of open science. And so there's quite a lot of tools that you need in your skill set to be able to do properly open science. It's one thing to write some R code, but it's another thing for someone to be able to actually understand what you are doing and to be able to run it themselves. So I'm going to try and teach you some of the tools that exist in the R ecosystem to help you make your code work on other people's systems. There's a huge amount of tools in this whole world, and I can't really cover even a fraction of them. What I'm going to focus on in this is making your code run on other people's computers, or making other people able to run your code. So like having the right packages installed and having the right dependencies installed so that other people can quickly grab your code and run it and check your analysis. What I'm not going to cover, which is really critical to this whole workflow, is Git and GitHub. So if you don't know what Git and GitHub are, there's some links at the top of this tutorial that I'm pointing out here, which give you like a really nice introduction to Git and GitHub. I'm going to kind of assume that you have a little bit of familiarity with it. We're not going to use it. We're not going to run a bunch of commands, but this kind of stuff depends on your code being on GitHub, because that's how we share code as scientific. When we write scientific code, we share it on GitHub. So we'll look a bit at GitHub as we go through, but I'm not really going to teach you how to use it. I'm going to teach you how to, once you've got someone's code off of GitHub, how to make it run. That's what we're focusing on today. Okay, so this first meme kind of gives a context to what I really want to tell you guys about. We often pass our code on to someone and expect it to just run on their computer, right? You'll say, if they say, oh, I'll get an error when I run it, you'll say, well, it works on my machine. And the amount of times we've all heard people say, oh, it works on my machine, you eventually want to pull a gun on them because everyone thinks if it works on their computer, it should work on yours. But what the modern way of doing things is that it's my responsibility as the person who's writing the code to make sure that I give you everything you need to be able to run my code on your machine. So I'm going to teach you the tools to make that possible now. So when we pass our code on to someone, there's a lot of reasons why it might not work, right? Someone might not have the same packages as we have, and then maybe they can install those packages, but maybe they'll install the wrong versions of those packages. Maybe they have a different version of R. Often there's dependencies. So some packages in R depend on other software on your computer. And if you don't have all of this right, either your code's not going to run properly, it's just going to break and give you an error, or perhaps even worse, your code might run and give you a different result, which is really not what we want. We need some way of making sure that our code produces the exact same result in someone else's machine. So this whole, what I was just describing to you, the software you're using, and we're talking about R here, the packages that R is using, and the things that your packages depend on. This is what there's a word for this it's called our environment, our software environment. And your code runs or is executed by an environment. And we need, if we want to make our research reproducible, we don't just need to hand our code over. We need to hand over the instructions to recreate the environment that ran the code. It's not just enough to say, oh, I ran it in R. Here you go. You run it in R now. That's kind of a cop-out because there's a lot of reasons why things might fall over when someone else tries to run that. So fortunately, the people behind R and R Studio have designed some really nice tools to make this all work and to make this possible. So today I'm going to talk about a couple of those tools, and the first one I'm going to talk about is a package called renv. So you guys, if you want to follow along with what I'm doing, you're going to need to install 1 or 2 packages if that's what you do. You don't have to follow along because, like I said, there's this blog post here, and you'll be able to follow through the blog post. But if you do want to follow along, there's a few packages that you might want to install that I'm just going to show you now. So you want to install renv. So renv is kind of what we're going to talk about in the first part here. So you do that by running install .packages renv. So that's the first package we're going to use. We're also going to use just 2 other packages. I'm assuming that you have like ggplot and stuff installed. Install.packages use this. That's also a nice package with just kind of a few handy helper functions that we're going to use to make things quicker in R. And another package we're going to use at the end is called Holepunch. And Holepunch you have to install by running dev tools install git hub and it's called /hole punch. Just want to check that that's correct. So there you go. So run those commands if you want to follow along. Otherwise, you'll find them in the tutorial. So let's go back to tutorial. So renv is really what's going to package up our environment for us in R. It's a nice new package that RStudio has just released. And what renv does, it is essentially creates a file that it puts in our project, and in that file, it essentially writes out the instructions for the versions and the packages and the repositories that all of that stuff came from. So an example file would look like this, right? Here's the version of R it'll write out. This file is called a lock file, and this lock file contains all these instructions. So, and it tells you what version of R you're using, what packages you're using in that project, and all the versions of those packages that you require. So it's really easy to use this renv will write this file for you automatically and basically make it easy for people to then input this file and recreate the environment which you use. So remember that word environment is like a critical word. It's not just a word I made up. This is a concept that people in every other software environment or research computing use. So all of the tools I'm teaching you today are a very core part of using Python, for example. Python has a whole system of packaging your environment and making sure that this type of information is written out nicely for you. So I'm going to teach you the R ecosystem here, but these tools exist everywhere in other research software, and it's essentially it's an essential part of making your research reproducible or creating reproducible software if you're trying to be a software engineer and not just write research code. So, like I said, the first thing we want to do is install renv. And before we start working on something, there's a few key commands. I'm gonna just give you a rundown of how it works, and then we'll do a little example. So we install renv, and then before we start working on a project, we run this thing renv init. So init essentially says, I want you to to create a log file that records what packages I use. So it sort of initializes the project. Then we work as we normally would. We write our .r file, we load and install packages, and then we run this command renv snapshot. And renv snapshot scans all the .r files in your project and writes into the file, the lock file, which packages you require to run the project. So now you've got this kind of well-documented file of what is required to run that code. If you make some changes and break stuff, what you can do is then run renv restore, and it'll just go back to all the packages and the versions of the packages that you had in the last time you ran snapshot. So that's all you really need to know, those three commands. There's nothing more to renv than initializing a project, taking a snapshot to write down and record what packages the project depends on, and then you can restore it if you've done something wrong, or if someone else wants to take your file and reproduce that, then they can run renv restore. So that's it, 3 commands, and essentially you have this really nice reproducible environment and a way of documenting your environment in R. A nice thing, something to remember is, because you only run these commands once when you initialize a project or when you want to take a snapshot. So you don't have to put them in your scripts. You just run them in the R console when you start a project. So I'm going to kind of demonstrate how that works now. So before I do that, there's kind of a word of warning. When you start using renv, when you initialize a project with renv, it kind of starts from a blank slate. It forgets about all the packages that you've installed before and starts installing packages from fresh. So if I start a new project and I run renv init, I will have no packages because I haven't installed packages into that environment that I just created. This can kind of make it slow when you start using it because you've got to reinstall all the packages. But it doesn't, when you start a new project and you renv init a new project, you won't have to install all those packages fresh again. It'll just go and fetch copies of the packages that you've previously installed after running renv init. So that kind of probably doesn't make much sense until we actually do this ourselves. So we're going to do this ourselves, and I'll just make a standard little ggplot. I'm going to do it in RStudio, and you can kind of get a better idea of what I'm actually talking about. So so let me start. Kind of nice way to do this is that we always want to do things in a project, right? So if I'm starting a new project now in R, okay, so I'm going to start a new directory, and this is just going to be called ggplot demo. I don't want to put it in there. I'm going to put it in our projects. Okay. So I'm just creating a new project to make this demo in. So this is how we start off in R all the time, right? In a new console, in a new project. So the first thing we do is, so if you have to have renv installed, obviously, but if I've got renv installed, then I initialize this project. So renv init. So I've started my project as an renv project. Now, what I'm going to do is just make a simple little ggplot. So we want to do this in a script. So library ggplot2, and then we just make a plot, ggplot. We're going to use this iris data, which is by default in R, so we don't have to load up anything weird. And we just do one of these kind of standard plots, right? Sepal dot length x is equal to sepal length, y is equal to petal dot length, color equals to species, and we make a point graph. Hopefully you guys all know how to use ggplot. So what we might see now, so if I run this, that's what I expected to happen. The first thing is that although I had ggplot installed previously, because I've initialized this as an renv project, I've got a clean slate of packages. I have nothing installed except for the default R packages. So I need to install ggplot into this environment. So now I just run install. Because I've initialized it, this is installing into my current environment. Install packages, ggplot2. And if you were doing this for the first time, it would take quite a while, but because I've installed ggplot2 in renv before, it's very quick. So now I can just run my code, blah, blah, blah. Species, how did I do that wrong? I think it's like that, species. That's obviously the result we expect from this data set. So now I want to save my file in my project. Let's just call it species.r, how we would normally do it. And this is our project folder. It's just got our project and our species thing. And if I can take a snap. Now I'm ready to take a snapshot of my project. Sorry, I've initialized my project, and now I take a snapshot. Yes, I want to proceed. So what you'll see now, if I just go out and back into this directory, here I've got a lock file written and this RN folder which is holding the packages. So this project now is completely isolated. All the packages that I need are documented in this rn.lock file, and this little folder here contains the packages. It doesn't necessarily contain all the files for the packages, but it might point to where on my computer those packages are, but it essentially has information to run all the packages. So now you've got essentially a isolated environment to run your project. Okay. Just got to bring up this chat box because I can't see if you guys are saying anything. You guys got. Okay, well, I'll just keep going. So the next, so that's the basics of using it. If I want to share my project with someone, all I have to do is give them the code and the lock file, and they can then initialize the project themselves. So the way that that might look is, so let me just, I've got a project that I've been working on with the data in a GitHub repo, and the packages that I've used are all described in a lock file. And what I'm going to do now is show you guys, and you can do it yourself if you're following along, is that you can take that code from the GitHub repository with the lock file and initialize the project using renv, and it'll automatically set up all the packages that are required to run that project. So this project that I'm going to describe to you, just try and get this freaking chat box, this box up here, because I'd really like to see what you guys are saying. Sorry guys, just trying to find where you've all gone. Sorry, I just had to stop screen sharing because I lost this chat box and I couldn't see what was going on. So I'm going to start sharing my screen again, just so that we can, I can see the chat again. I'm not sure why this wasn't showing up on top. Okay, looks like I can see you again, and I can see the chat box. Perfect, that's what I want. Okay, so to just review what I've showed you now, I initialized this project with renv init and wrote some code, installed the packages I need, and then took a snapshot of it. And it now creates this file, this lock file, which describes everything I need. I'm just going to share, I'll share the link again to the blog because I can see people are asking for it. And it's obviously going to be useful if here's the link again. So now we're going to try to do this in a way that kind of that replicates a bit more of a real life workflow. We're going to clone a Git repository, so copy the code that I've set up somewhere, and initialize an environment that copies the environment that I was using. So we're going to do this with some data that Seon has collected in the past. This is data from Jonkershoek near Stellenbosch from the paired catchment experiments. So what you'll see in this data set is what was done is that stream flow was measured in rivers in a Fynbos catchment, and what was done in one of these rivers, one of the catchments, was planted up with pine trees. And as the pine trees grew and aged, the amount of reduction in the flow of the river through the pine forested catchment was measured. So what we're trying to study here is essentially how the flow of these rivers, of this one particular river, or actually there was a few of them, of a few particular rivers, was reduced as a plantation aged that was planted over the river. So there's links to the full report that describes the data, but all you need to know is in this data set, you'll see there's a column for age, which is how many years it's been since the plantation was established, a species, so the tree species that is planted, this condition column, which we're not going to use, a location, which is the specific catchment, and then a percentage flow reduction. So in that year, how much was the flow reduced from the natural expected flow in that catchment? So we're going to work with this data. We're not really going to do a full analysis, but we're going to copy the code and set up an environment based on the one for that analysis. So the way we're going to do that is, let me go back to this project. So just start a new project. So what we want to do is clone the data that's on GitHub. I've got a repository on GitHub. I can show it to you. So this is just how your data might normally look. There's in a GitHub repository, there's a .r file and an R project, and I've added a lock file with this. So this is my GitHub repo, and we're going to clone this repo. So to make this easy, there's a nice little some helper functions that we can get out of, that we can get from this package that I mentioned earlier called use this. So in use this, sorry, I'm just going to have to go and fetch the code that I wrote earlier. So we want to load up this library. Let me start a script actually. Library use this. That's the package. This is just like a helper package that helps us to clone Git repos and stuff. So we're going to use this, and there's a command to clone. I'm just going to go and find the script somewhere. Quite horrible when everyone's watching what you're doing on your computer. You can't do anything in the background without them seeing it, unfortunately. So let me just go and find the script. Just want to copy a bit of code out of here. So that's what I wanted to run. So this is going to clone that GitHub repository. So if I say create from GitHub, this is the name of the GitHub repository. Actually, it's called that. and this is, I'm going to put it into this folder. So you'll see it automatically opens a new project with that GitHub repo. And here's all the files that you saw in GitHub. So if this is the actual script that I want to run, and here's the lock file that describes what I need to run it. So if I have renv installed, all I need to do is renv init, and that will initialize this project now as an renv project. And if I type renv restore, it's now going to take the lock file that I got off of GitHub and restore all the packages that are described in that file. So yes, I want to proceed. And now I can just run this whole script. So I don't want to go through it in too much detail, but basically I just read in some data. You can have a look at the data. So as I showed you, age, species, location, and the flow reduction. And you can have a look at what that data looks like. So here you can see these different flow reductions that the different species and sites are giving us. And I fit a little regression to this and plot it. And so here's some pretty dodgy curves fitted to the data. So what this workflow essentially achieves is not just making the code reproducible by pulling it, well, the code downloadable by pulling it off of GitHub, but the environment as well. So that renv is allowing us to just go renv init and renv restore and bring us back to the same place that the person who wrote this code was when they ran it. And if you follow this workflow, in 99% of cases, you'll never have that problem of code not being able to run on your machine. renv it's not just some random, I mean, there's a lot of R packages nowadays, and a lot of them are kind of, it sometimes feels like it's not worth investing your time because someone else is going to come up with a bigger and better package. But renv is sort of the RStudio standard package now for creating reproducible environments. So it's not just something that's going to come and go. They're supporting it, and this is kind of the de facto way that you should be using in R to make sure that your code runs on anyone's machine. Okay, so I'm going to move on from this to a different section, but if you guys want to raise your hands or ask any questions in the chat box now about renv and this workflow, it's best to do it now before we move on to a slightly different topic. Well, similar topic, but a different workflow. You can just drop a question in the chat box if you want. So the first question is about using this without GitHub. So you don't have to use GitHub. Is just a kind of standard way of sharing code, but you could, if you email an R file to someone and you email a lock file. So the R file describes the code and the lock file describes essentially the environment. You know, your R file will load various packages with library, etc., but it doesn't necessarily have any knowledge or any description about the packages that were installed and the version of R that was installed and on that person's computer, and the lock file describes that. So if you want to, you don't have to use GitHub. Of course, it's best practice to use GitHub, but you could literally just email an R file and a lock file, and someone could then create a project, put in your R file and your lock file, and initialize that with that lock file. And you do need that structure that I showed you. So I can show you how it is in this here. So you want, you always need to be working out of an R project. That's just how we work in R nowadays. So here's your R project home. Here's a script that I'm running. You could have a whole bunch, of course, and the lock file then must sit next, in the same folder in the root directory with the R project. So this all essentially that you need: the project home, your R file, and the lock file. The other stuff, the git ignores and the readmes are sort of GitHub specific things. There's a few more questions I can see coming, so I'm not going to move on just yet. So like I was showing, there's the lock file essentially scans your R file when you run renv. When you run renv snapshot, it scans your R file for all the calls to library, and then it records those files and their dependencies in the lock file. So you can have one R file, but you can have 100 different R files in different folders. As long as they're in subfolders of the R project, it'll scan all those .r files and record all the packages that are required for the calls to library in the lock file. And you both need to, so the one thing that you can't solve is that you need to have renv installed before you can do any of this. You don't have to go around manually installing the packages that someone else had to run their code, but you do have to have renv, because of course you can't, you can't start from nothing. Okay, so there'll be time hopefully at the end for a few more questions, but I think those are very helpful in clarifying things that I kind of maybe missed. So we're going to go on to a slightly more comprehensive way of packaging our environment. Because what renv does is renv packages the dependencies that are required essentially in R. All it says is this is the R version and these are the packages. But there's a couple of reasons why, that's something you might want to go further than that. So R also can have, the packages you run in R can have dependencies themselves. So like they may require certain software installed on your computer, right? And using lock files and using this workflow also requires other people to download your code, to install the packages. You kind of need, the person has, there's quite a lot of commitment involved from the other person who might want to check your analysis before they're actually going to be able to run your code. I mean, it's not that much, but when it comes to this kind of scientific reproducibility, you want to make it really as easy as possible for people to be able to run our analysis. The optimal situation that we're kind of aiming for is where somebody can essentially just click on a button in a GitHub repository that'll then fire up a virtual machine that has your code and your data and everything needed to run your analysis. So with one click, it just sort of creates a virtual computer that can run your code. And if that sounds sort of idealistic and far-fetched, it's not. I'm about to teach you that, and we really have the tools to do that, to make your data interactively explorable by anyone who just wants to click on a button in your GitHub repository. So the tool one of the tools, the one I'm going to teach you, that we use to do this is called Binder. So Binder is sort of an open source project that all it requires from you is it requires you to paste in the location of your GitHub repository, and it will create a virtual computer that runs the code in your GitHub repository. You need more than just your GitHub repository. You need one or two little files in your GitHub repository which tell Binder what needs to be installed. And of course, you also kind of either you can put your data in the GitHub repository, or you can have your data somewhere that your script loads from a website somewhere. So to essentially show you what that might look like. So this is Binder, where you land on the page if you go to binder.org. And all I need to do is paste in, if I've got the right files in my GitHub repository, I'll just paste in the URL of that repository and click launch, and it will build a virtual machine that will that'll clone the code and the data in that repository and create an online RStudio server that will allow you to run that code. So essentially, say you've got a collaborator or a reviewer or some interested person who's interested in your work and they want to see what your code does, they just have to click in your GitHub repository and it'll automatically create a virtual machine that runs your code. So they don't need to have R installed, they don't need to do anything on their own computer, it all happens online. And I'm going to show you how to do that yourselves now. So just go back to, so there's an R package that kind of automates this whole thing for you. Like I said, you need to have a few specific files in your GitHub repository. So there's a nice R package that I mentioned earlier called Holepunch. So if you want to install it, you're going to install it from GitHub, DevTools, install GitHub, Holepunch, this command over here. And all you need to do is run a few commands and it'll prepare your repository for running on Binder. So let me show you how that would work using the repository we were working in earlier. So this is what we were just working in, right? We cloned this from GitHub, as you saw earlier. We just pulled in this repository. And it has a lock file, but it doesn't actually have the files that Binder wants. The lock file contains most of the information that, that Binder needs. It doesn't have all of it though, so we have to create a separate file. I think because lock files are quite new and this renv process is quite new, I think that Binder is going to catch up and start, and you'll just be able to use the lock file to create the Binder. But for now, we have to run a few separate extra lines of code. So all we have to do is, so remember, I'm working in this project folder here. So I'm going to load library Holepunch. I'm not sure if I have it installed. Do I have it installed? Okay, it's not installed, so I must run that command. Dev tools install GitHub. /Holepunch. Okay, so that's going to install the package that will create these Binder files for me. And should go quite quickly. Cool. So there's three commands like renv. All that is required of us is running 1 or 2 or 3 commands. With all of this workflow that I'm teaching you, I think the people who write the software recognize that if you have to go through a pretty complicated workflow, no one's going to do this. So literally all you ever have to do is run 2 commands really in R. And if by running those 2 commands, you package the whole thing up to be reproducible. So for this, all we have to do is obviously we have to load Holepunch. And inside, as long as we don't have to save this file, we just have to run it once inside inside this project. So the first one is write install. So that writes a file to tell Binder what it needs to install, and then you write another one, write runtime, and that tells it just a bit more information that it needs to know. So I run that. And now you can't see the files because it's in a hidden folder inside here. So there's a little .binder folder that's hidden from you, but it's written them, I promise you. And now this package, this project, this R project, has all the information it required to create a binder, a virtual machine through binder. So the last command that I need to run is generate batch. And what that does, so if you're familiar with GitHub, you know about these README files. So your README file just has like a little text description of what's in the repository, right? So it's like, you know, if I go to the home of this repo, code and data to demonstrate best practices in R, you'll see it's what it looks like over here. So this is the README file. So what binder does, if I run this command, generate badge, it creates this text here. So, and it says copy and paste the following lines into your README file. So I can copy and paste that, and paste it here into my README file. And then I'll obviously save my README file and push it to GitHub, right? That's how we would normally do this. So what I've done here is take my project, write the files that binder needs to create a binder, and then added a link to a binder already. So if I push this to GitHub, what you'll get is something that looks like this. So here's just another repository where I've done this already, and you get this that code that I showed you there adds this little badge to your GitHub. The badge says launch binder, and if I click this badge, it starts building the binder, which will have my code running in it. So this is probably going to take longer than I expected. I ran it earlier, but it looks like it failed. So that's unfortunate. So what will happen is it's going to run, it's now going to set up a little virtual machine for me. And eventually what will open is an RStudio instance in this window that has cloned all of the contents of the repository in which that badge was. So I'll just go back to that repository. So here was the badge, and remember that badge we added just by creating this text here by running generate badge, pasting it into our README. And now I click that badge, and it starts this process of building a repository, of building a virtual machine that will copy my code and allow me to play with my code. So I did this earlier, and now it's died. So I can't show you right now. It's going to take a couple of minutes to build this. Maybe maybe in 10 minutes or so it'll be done, and I can show you. It takes, the first time you do it, it takes like 10 minutes or so, and then subsequently it should be able to run in like 5 minutes. It'll create a binder for you. I can actually show you. I can show you one that might go a bit quicker. This one from that binder has put up itself. So here's a badge launch binder, and this one should go quite quickly. Hopefully. I'm going to come back to this just now. But yeah, I see there's a question. So now's a good time to ask questions while this ticks away in the background. Yeah, so there's two ways to launch binder. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm using like the verbs correctly to create a binder or launch a binder, but a binder is basically takes your GitHub repository, and from the GitHub repository launches a virtual computer in your browser. So there's two ways to do it. You can use this workflow I'm showing you, which is to run these commands in R. So you add these by running write install and write runtime. It adds the necessary files to your GitHub repository that Binder needs, and then you just generate this little badge, and then you can click on that. The other way to do it is to simply go to the Binder website and paste the URL of your GitHub repository and click launch, and then it'll do the same thing. But remember, this will only work if those files, the install and the runtime file, are in your GitHub repository. So you don't necessarily, you can just go back, you don't necessarily need to run this generate badge command. You can just run these two, which create the necessary files, and then push this to GitHub. But and then do this. But those files are required, the runtime and the install file, those files. Binder needs to read those files in order to figure out what it has to install. So I hope that makes that clear. Hopefully in a minute or two, these will finish running so that you can see what it actually looks like. It's quite, yeah. So there's a very good question from Ian about using non-R, like about non-R dependencies. So what those two files that we're writing, the require and the install file, they're pretty much like the lock file. They're just describing what version of R you're using and the packages that your analysis depends on. What they don't say anything about is the other stuff installed on your computer. So this is like the next level of, I don't know if pain is the right word, but the next sort of level of complexity where you can actually specify exactly what software your whole analysis depends on. So I'm going to show you a bit about that now. And what I'm not going to go through today, but there's a part 2 to this tutorial that I've already created, and I just have to publish. And that part 2 covers something called software called Docker, and Docker is software that basically takes this to like the next level where you fully specify all of the sort of all of the packages that need to be installed to run your analysis. So not just R and its packages, but you start essentially from a bare bones installation of Ubuntu, and then you write what you need on top of that to run your analysis. So you almost wrap up the entire computer. And that might seem like overkill, but for certain things it is important. And there's going to be a tutorial after this that you can sort of read on the SAN website that will give you some more information on how that works. So there's another question. So Peter, if you're referring to the script being this stuff here, like the stuff that creates the necessary files to run a binder, yeah, this doesn't need to be part of your R code that you put on GitHub, because it's just writing some extra files to your repository. So you run this once and it creates the necessary information that Binder needs, and then you send it off, and nobody needs to see this code again, because this is just writing some files that are required. So your repo, at least to people who use and clone your repository, will look like it normally should, right? It's just going to have like a README file, maybe a git ignore some data, and an R file. You don't need to have some weird extra files that someone has to run in order to create binders and stuff. The binder stuff is almost invisible to the people. All a collaborator has to do, or the kind of a potential user you might imagine is like a reviewer. All a reviewer would have to do is click on that badge on your GitHub repository, and then this amazing virtual computer would just appear with the code and the data that they can play with. And that's like hopefully what I'm trying to achieve here, but sometimes this stuff takes like a long time. As you can see, it's still starting the repository. So because this is being run for free and hosted for free, sometimes it takes 5 minutes, sometimes it takes half an hour, because a whole bunch of other people are also running things on Binder. And maybe by the end of it, we'll get to this point where we can actually see it. So I'm almost near the end of this. There's just one more thing that I think is worth mentioning, and I'm not going to run it in R, but it's worth knowing about. So it essentially repeats this workflow, but using a slightly different concept called a research compendia. So maybe some of you might have heard about research compendia, which are essentially like a full package of a research project that can be published that fully describe your work. So something that what this might look like is, say, if this is your home folder here that says compendium, you've got your data in a folder here, you've got your analysis here, which might have some markdown documents and some R files, you've got a license and a README, and you've got a full description of, the project metadata, the package dependencies, who wrote it. This is like almost, you got to think of it as a full package describing a project. It's more than just some code, but it describes who wrote the code, what packages were described, and it builds on top of the stuff that I've been talking about before. It seems like a whole big thing to create some sort of gold standard for reproducibility like this, but we've already done, by these previous steps I went through before, documenting your environment using renv and using something like Binder, you've already done most of the steps. So this description file is kind of the core to a research compendium. And what you'd see in a description file is like the name of the package, South African Streamflow, a title, a version, the names of the authors, and the packages that the compendium depends on. And what's kind of this, while this might seem again like a pain of something to create, we can use Holepunch there's a simple command we can just run write compendium description. If I run this and give it the name of the package and the description and the version, it'll write this file for me. So by adding this file to our project, the one we've been working on, this then becomes a research compendium because it now has a description, it has a license associated with it, it's got some metadata to describe the project. So all we need to do is really run this one line, that's this one function in Holepunch to create this. And now we'll have a description file in this folder. So I think the last time I tried to write this, it failed. So I'm just going to run the default command, see what happens. Yeah, it failed. So this should work for you. I don't know why it's not working on my computer right now. I tested it this morning and saw that it failed and I couldn't get it to work, so I gave up. But the idea is it'll create this description file, which is essentially the backbone of a research compendium. And now all of that information will be in this Git repository, and you can push that to GitHub, and you'll have a Binder badge and this description, and that's pretty much the gold standard. And you can pat yourself on the back that you've essentially created a properly reproducible workflow. Once we've done this, of course, I can show you what, I created an example here. So this GitHub repository, this one here. So this one is based on that code, and here we've got this description file that I built earlier for a research compendium in this GitHub repository. And it has this, all of the a .binder file, which has the necessary files that Binder needs. That's what we created when we were running those Holepunch commands. And here's the launch Binder badge. And the last thing that we can do, which kind of closes the loop on this, is that we can publish the contents of this repository on a database or on some sort of open platform that then associate this code and this package, this research compendium, with the DOI, so that you can then cite that. So say I write a paper and this GitHub repository has the code and the data to produce the paper. I can now associate a DOI with this and cite that in my paper and say all the code and the data are available here, and there's a citable, and you can cite this GitHub repository. The kind of workflow for doing that would be to go to somewhere like Figshare is a common website where we might do this. There's other ones called like Zenodo, for example. So I'd go to Figshare, and this is my Figshare account. And here's your button to create like a new object on Figshare. So what you normally might do is upload a data set to Figshare, right? So I'll have some data set with metadata that I want to share with people. I'll upload it here, and it'll get a DOI associated with it. But we can also do that with our code in GitHub. If we've produced this additional data, like a description, and published it to GitHub as a research compendium, all I would have to do is click this button here, import from GitHub, and I can choose the GitHub repo of mine that has all of this information in it. So I've done that already with this one, Catchments demo. So you see it here, published on Figshare with the description, and these binder files are in here as well, and all the code and stuff. And it has a DOI associated with it somewhere. And if on the repository, here's the repository. You can link to that DOI and the paper that the code is in. And this is really a kind of watertight. I mean, there's other ways, there's problems that you can encounter with this, like the one that was mentioned earlier, having the dependencies for your R packages themselves. But as far as I've taught you today, this is kind of like the watertight endpoint that you want to reach, where you've got your code published somewhere on GitHub and archived on Figshare with a DOI, with all of this information in a lock file to recreate it, and a .binder so that you can launch a binder instance that will run your code if you've got the patience to wait half an hour. But normally it goes faster, I promise. In this tutorial that I just went through, this idea of a research compendium is described in a nice paper. So if you read through here, there's some details on it, and a link to the paper. The paper over here kind of goes through the logic of this and what these things should look like, and why it's important. So if you're kind of interested in this, then I encourage you to read this paper, which kind of motivates for why this workflow is important. Hopefully before we log off, this will launch. But for now, if there's any other questions about this workflow, and like if you feel as though there's something you didn't understand, or if you feel as though this isn't worth it for some reason, I'm happy to try and defend why it is worth it. So please shoot any questions you have in the chat box. And also, like I said, this tutorial I'm going to publish at the moment, it's on this temporary site. I can see as I was going through it now, I saw like horrendous spelling errors and a whole bunch of stuff wrong with it. So I'm going to update it, and it'll eventually be on the SEON website, where with a follow-up tutorial which describes this technology, this sort of next step further Docker that Ian was asking about. So yeah, if you have any questions or criticism, or you want me to justify this further, or if you think it's too much of a hack to do, I think it's probably, you can say that. But I think if you read through this tutorial I wrote and look at how few, all this really involves is running 1 or 2 lines of code to create a file that lives alongside your code, and the problem of it works on my machine goes away essentially. So there's a question that was written earlier that I didn't get to, which is, do you share your raw data with collaborators and reviewers? You should. It depends on, so the workflow that I demonstrated here, there was just a little text file in the GitHub repository that the code was pulling in. And that's obviously, not an ideal situation. What you should have, if you're going to do it like that, you should have the data itself should be published on somewhere like Figshare as a separate Figshare repository with its own DOI and its own metadata, and then your code can pull it in. So you would have a line in your R code that says download data from Figshare, and then the data is well archived and well described on Figshare, and your code pulls it in. So this is a separate kind of workflow for archiving code and for ensuring that it works wherever it goes. And you need to combine that with well-documented and well-archived data, which I didn't do here. I just had a little text file. But of course, to do this properly, then you also need to do it properly with data. What you won't be able to do with Binder is that it just produces quite small machines. So what will come up here is a little RStudio thing that's essentially running on a very tiny computer. So it's not going to be able to analyze a large data. It's not going to be able to download a large data set into Binder, and it's not going to be able to do any sort of computation that requires like, a couple of processors or a lot of RAM. This is just for kind of exploring doing a bit of exploration and allowing other people to check your analysis. If you had something that required like quite a lot of computing resources and you wanted to allow people to reproduce that, then you would use Docker, which as I mentioned, there'll be a separate tutorial that you can read over about how to use Docker. My data, the question about the data, and so when I was doing this, there's a CSV file in here, so catchments.csv. So when I ran my R code, it just said read.csv, and this data was in the repository. That's kind of incorrect because the CSV file, doesn't have good metadata to describe what's going on. So what you would do in a real scenario is that this data, this catchments.csv, would be on Figshare, for example, with its own metadata, and my catchments.r file would download that data into once there'd be a line or something in my catchments.r file that downloads that data. I think, yeah, GitHub is not a good place to publish your data if you can't really document it. I mean, you can probably try and document. You can add a metadata file in GitHub, but it's better. The data in some ways has a separate is a separate entity to the code that analyzes the data. So you should have the data published as a separate thing to the code that analyzes the data. So put it in a separate Figshare repository, for example. And that's like the gold standard we for reproducibility is to have, if you go and collect a data set and write a script to write some code to analyze that data, you upload the data with good metadata to Figshare or whatever is the appropriate repository, and then you publish the code with something like a lock file to describe the environment. You publish that on GitHub, and then you archive that. Then you might publish a paper and the code in that GitHub repository, if you want to archive it, so you archive it to Figshare, so that the code that was used to create the paper is archived on Figshare. And adding the binder is like a neat, nice to have type of thing, so that people can quickly just fire up something to explore the data. I'm going to try and stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to do that. Stop sharing. Okay, so yeah, there will be, you've got the link to this. There will be a subsequent tutorial that I'll put up. I'm not sure. I suppose we can share it. It'll be on our Seon Fambos node website, and so will this eventually. Hopefully with all of the spelling errors removed and I'll probably update it a little bit just to make it a bit neater. But yeah, these will be available for you, and the video from this as well. So I encourage you to use these tools to run these two commands. Maybe you're not going to use them all the time when you're just fiddling around, but if you're planning on publishing your code or publishing something based on the code, this is an essential workflow. And if you are and then if you